had always liked camping alone. It was one of the few things in life that gave me peace. Being in the middle of nowhere, away from people, away from noise, away from everything that made life complicated. It felt right. It gave me a sense of control. I could pack what I wanted, set up camp where I wanted, and leave when I wanted. It was simple. That's why, in late September, I packed my gear and drove 3 hours to a national forest I had visited a few times before. It wasn't a well-known camping area, which made it perfect. No tourists, no crowded trails, just miles of woods, rivers, and mountains. I planned to hike in about 5 miles, set up camp near a small stream, and stay for 2 nights. I had checked the weather, cool but dry.
No rain, no storms.
It was supposed to be a perfect trip. I arrived at the trailhead just after noon, parked my truck, and started hiking. The path was narrow but well-worn. Trees lined both sides, their leaves just beginning to change colors. I walked at a steady pace, listening to the crunch of leaves under my boots, the distant sound of birds, the occasional rustle of something moving in the underbrush. Probably a deer, maybe a rabbit. Nothing unusual. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached the spot I had in mind. A small clearing near a slow-moving stream, surrounded by thick trees. It was perfect. I set down my pack, stretched my legs, and got to work setting up my tent. I kept things simple: a one-person tent, a small fire pit, my sleeping bag, and a lightweight cooking setup. By the time I finished, the sun had started dipping lower in the sky. I collected firewood, stacked it near the pit, and sat down to rest. The air was crisp, cool, and completely still. I made a quick meal, just some canned beans and beef jerky, then sat by the fire listening to the quiet. As the sun set, the woods changed. The warm glow of daylight faded, and the trees became dark shadows against the sky. The noises changed too. The birds went silent, replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets, the distant crack of a branch. I had camped enough times to know this was normal. The woods had their own rhythm. I stayed up for a while, letting the fire burn low, enjoying the peacefulness of it all. Then, when the cold started creeping in, I put out the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped it shut. I left a small flashlight beside me, along with my knife. I never went camping without it. Not because I was scared, but because it was smart. Out here, you had to be prepared. I lay there for a while, staring at the roof of the tent, listening to the sounds outside. The wind moving through the trees, the distant trickle of the stream, the occasional rustle of something in the undergrowth. I let my mind drift, my body relaxed, and soon, I fell asleep. I don't know what woke me up. 1 second, I was sleeping. The next, I was awake, my body tense, my heart pounding. I lay still, listening. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and pointed it at my watch. Just after 2 a.m. I turned the light off, my eyes adjusting to the dark. I listened again. Nothing. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe a dream, a sound, something my brain picked up on without realizing it. I took a slow breath, forced my body to relax, and closed my eyes again. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember was a noise outside my tent. A crunch, then another. Footsteps, not an animal. I know what a deer sounds like. I know what a raccoon sounds like. This wasn't that. These were slow, deliberate steps. I stayed still, breathing as quietly as I could, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. Silence. Then a sound. A slow, dragging sound against the fabric of my tent. Something or someone was touching it. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. My hand tightened around my knife. I didn't move. The dragging stopped. More silence. Then the footsteps moved away. I waited, listening, counting the seconds. 30, 60, full minute, then 2, then 5, nothing. Finally, I reached for my flashlight, flicked it on, and pointed it toward the tent wall. Nothing there. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, just enough to see outside. I scanned the clearing with the light, the fire pit, the trees, the stream. Nothing, but I knew what I heard. I sat there for a long time, my knife in my hand, my ears straining for any sound. But the woods were quiet again. After an hour of nothing, I let myself lie back down. I didn't sleep. Morning came slow. When the sky started turning gray, I finally unzipped the tent fully and stepped outside. The air was cold. The forest was still. Everything looked the same, but I knew it wasn't. I circled my camp, checking the ground, and then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. Someone had been there. I followed them a few feet toward the trees, but they disappeared into the underbrush. Whoever it was had been standing just outside my tent, watching. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had in my life. My plan had been to stay another night. That wasn't happening. I had no idea who had been out there, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I shouldered my pack, took one last look around, and started hiking back. The whole time I felt it, that feeling you get when someone is watching you. I kept my knife in my hand, my steps quick, my eyes scanning the trees. The trail felt longer than it had the day before. The woods felt different, like they weren't just woods anymore, like they belonged to someone else. By the time I reached my truck, I was sweating, even in the cold air. I threw my pack in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath, staring at the trailhead. Then, I started the engine and got the hell out of there. I never went back. I never told anyone, because what could I say? That someone had been out there? That someone had watched me while I slept? That someone had stood just inches away, in the middle of the night, while I lay there, completely unaware? No one would believe me, and even if they did, it wouldn't change the fact that it happened. I didn't believe in things like that. Stories about creatures that could steal a person's face. Things that lurked in the woods waiting for the right moment to slip into your skin. I heard them, sure. My uncle used to tell us about them when we were kids, huddled around a campfire just trying to scare us. I never took it seriously. Even when I got older, spending so much of my free time out in the wilderness, I never thought about them. I had hiked through miles of forest, hunted in deep valleys, camped on lonely ridges with nothing but the wind for company. The only things I ever had to worry about were the real dangers: bears, cougars, the cold, and sometimes other people. I wasn't afraid of the woods. That changed. I had a spot I liked to camp at. It wasn't anything special, just an old clearing at the base of a hill, not too far from a river but far enough that I wouldn't have to deal with the noise. I'd found it years ago when I was tracking deer and started using it when I needed a break from everything. It was a cold autumn when I went out there for the last time. I packed light, just a tent, my rifle, some supplies. I didn't plan to stay long, just a night or two. It was more about getting away than anything else. The hike in was easy. The air was cool, crisp. I remember that because the trees had started to lose their leaves, and the wind kept knocking them loose. It was peaceful in a way, that kind of quiet that you don't get anywhere else. I set up camp by late afternoon, gathered some wood, and made a small fire. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, I was stretched out by the flames, listening to the night settle in. That's when I noticed it. It was small at first, just a feeling like being watched. That wasn't too unusual. I'd had that before. Sometimes it was a deer, sometimes a fox. But this was different. It wasn't the usual sharp awareness of something nearby. It was slower, like something creeping at the edge of my senses. I sat up, scanning the trees. The fire was throwing long shadows across the clearing, making it hard to see. The feeling didn't go away, but nothing moved. No sound, no breaking branches. I told myself it was nothing. I forced myself to relax, even though my skin was tight with unease. I didn't like how still it felt. Normally, the woods are never truly silent. There's always something. An owl, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. But that night, nothing. I stayed by the fire longer than I meant to, then finally crawled into my tent, keeping my rifle close. Sleep didn't come easily. I'd doze off, then jolt awake, heart hammering for no reason. I wasn't scared, not exactly, just restless. Like my body knew something my mind didn't. Then, sometime in the night, I heard it. A noise, soft, just outside the tent. It wasn't loud. Not the snap of a branch or the rustling of an animal. It was breathing. Long, slow, steady breaths. I lay there, frozen. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Waiting, listening. It was close. So close that I could almost feel it. I reached for my rifle, gripping it tight, my fingers cold with sweat. The breathing didn't stop. It stayed steady, just beyond the thin layer of fabric. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. And then, slowly, it moved. I could hear the shift of weight, something pressing into the ground. It was circling the tent. I stayed still, my whole body rigid, listening as it made its slow loop around me. Then suddenly it stopped. The breathing was right above me. I could hear it, deep, almost too deep. Then a voice. It wasn't mine. It wasn't human, but it was speaking. Said my name. My name. My stomach dropped, and my throat went dry. I had never told anyone I was coming out here. No one knew. I gripped the rifle tighter, my finger hovering over the trigger. I wanted to look, to unzip the tent and see, but something deep in me, some primal part of my brain, screamed at me not to. Then the breathing stopped. The silence stretched on. My ears rang from how hard I was straining to listen. Then footsteps, slow, dragging, moving away. I waited. I don't know how long. The fire outside had burned low, casting faint light against the tent walls. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light broke through the trees, I finally unzipped the tent and looked out. Nothing. The clearing was empty. My fire was just glowing embers. My pack was where I left it. Nothing was touched, but there were tracks. Big, wrong. Not animal, not human. And they led away from my tent. I packed up fast. I didn't eat, didn't stop. I left everything I didn't need and started hiking back. The whole way I felt it. That thing. Not close, not in sight, but there, watching. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. When I got in, I locked the doors and just sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to shake off the feeling. I haven't been back to that spot since. I don't camp alone anymore. And sometimes, when I'm outside at night, I swear I hear something. A breath, a voice, saying my name. I was never the kind of person who got scared easily. I grew up hunting, fishing, and camping in the woods, so I knew my way around the outdoors. I had spent nights alone under the stars more times than I could count. I was comfortable with the silence, the dark, and the feeling of being far from anyone else. But that trip changed something in me. It was the last time I ever camped alone. It was late September, the kind of time when the air had that crisp bite in the mornings, but the afternoons were still warm. I had taken a few days off work and decided to camp near a small river in the mountains, a place I had been to once before years ago. It was far from any town, miles away from paved roads, and deep enough into the wilderness that I doubted I would see anyone else. I packed my truck with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food and water, my rifle, my knife, and a small hatchet. I wasn't expecting to run into anything dangerous, but I always brought them out of habit. I wasn't a fool. The drive took nearly 4 hours, the last part being on rough dirt roads that were barely more than trails. The trees grew thick around me, towering pines and old, gnarled oaks that blocked out much of the sky. The road ended at a clearing near the river, and I parked there, stepping out to stretch my legs and take in the quiet. It was peaceful. The only sounds were the distant rush of water and the occasional call of a bird. I grabbed my pack and rifle and hiked about a mile downstream until I found a good spot. It was a small clearing near the water, surrounded by trees but open enough to see around me. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and made camp. By late afternoon, I had a fire going, my gear organized, and everything was set for a few nights in the wild. As the sun dipped lower, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal and watching the flames. The woods felt calm. I could hear the river, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. It was the kind of place that made you forget about everything else. No work, no stress, just the wilderness and the fire. That first night passed without anything unusual. I woke up early, cooked breakfast over the fire, and spent the day hiking along the river, fishing, and just enjoying the quiet. The water was cold and clear, and I caught a few fish, which I cleaned and cooked for dinner. Everything felt normal, but that night something changed. I woke up in the dark, unsure of what had pulled me from sleep. I lay still, listening, my breath slow and quiet. The fire had died down to embers, casting only the faintest glow. The air was still, too still. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any sound, but there was nothing. No wind, no crickets, no distant rustling of animals moving through the underbrush, just silence. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard it, a single, deliberate footstep. Not the quick, light steps of an animal, but something heavier, slower, careful. I lay there, heart pounding, gripping my rifle. My tent was zipped shut, but I didn't move. I didn't want to make a sound. Then another step, closer. I had camped enough to know that animals didn't move like that. A deer or a bear wouldn't step so cautiously, so deliberately. That was a person. I reached out slowly, feeling for the zipper of my tent. My fingers found it, but I hesitated. I didn't know what was out there. Another step, then nothing. The silence stretched on, so thick it felt like the woods were holding their breath. Minutes passed, 10, 15, maybe more. I stayed still, listening, waiting. Then, finally, I heard movement again, this time farther away. A slow, retreating step, then another, and another. Whatever it was leaving. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat up in my tent, gripping my rifle, ears straining for any sound. I waited until the first light of dawn before I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out. The fire had completely burned out. The clearing looked the same as before. Nothing seemed out of place. But then I saw them. Footprints, clear in the dirt, leading from the trees to the edge of my tent and then back again. Large, human, barefoot. They weren't mine. I packed up immediately. I kept my rifle in my hands the entire time, eyes scanning the trees, every hair on my body standing on end. Took me less than 10 minutes to break camp, and I didn't stop moving until I reached my truck. I threw everything in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The drive back felt longer than before. Every shadow between the trees felt wrong. Every sound made me grip the wheel tighter. I didn't stop until I was back in town. I never went back to that river. I don't camp alone anymore, and I never sleep without a locked door between me and whatever's out there. We had been planning the trip for weeks. My wife and I both needed a break from work, and there was something about getting away from everything that felt right. We chose a remote camping spot deep in the woods, a place neither of us had been before. It was far from the usual crowded campsites, miles away from the nearest town, and had no phone service. That was the appeal, real solitude, just the two of us. The drive there took hours, long stretches of empty roads surrounded by thick trees. We had packed everything we needed, enough food for a few days, extra clothes, a good tent, and a small propane stove. We also brought a hunting knife and a hatchet, not because we expected trouble, but because it's smart to be prepared in the wilderness. The last stretch of road was rough, an unpaved trail barely wide enough for our truck. It twisted through the forest, the trees pressing in close on both sides. The deeper we went, the darker it seemed, even though the sun was still high in the sky. Eventually, we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp. It was perfect, a flat area near a small stream, surrounded by tall trees. The only sound was the water moving over the rocks and the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind passed through. We set up the tent first, making sure it was secure. My wife gathered wood while I got the fire going. The sun started dipping below the trees, the sky turning shades of orange and pink. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you don't get in the city. That first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner over the fire, sat together under the stars, and listened to the sounds of the forest. There was something calming about it. Before heading to bed, I made sure the fire was completely out. Then we zipped ourselves into the tent, warm in our sleeping bags. I woke up sometime in the night. At first, I didn't know why. The woods were silent. No wind, no rustling, nothing. Just stillness. I listened for a while, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. Then, faintly, I heard its soft footsteps in the distance, moving through the dry leaves. I lay still, barely breathing. The steps weren't close, but they were steady, slow. Someone or something was out there. I reached for the hunting knife, gripping it tightly. The sound faded after a few minutes, and I told myself it was probably an animal. But even then, something didn't feel right. I stayed awake for a long time, listening, but eventually, exhaustion pulled me back under. The next morning, I didn't mention it to my wife. Maybe I should have, but I didn't want to scare her over nothing. We spent the day exploring, hiking through the woods, following the stream. There were no signs of anyone else out there, no trails, no campsites. That night, we sat by the fire again, eating and talking. But the feeling from the night before stuck with me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the dark trees. We turned in early, tired from the hike. I fell asleep faster this time, but it didn't last. I woke up to a sound right outside the tent. Not footsteps in the distance, something close. The slow crunch of leaves, the shift of weight on the ground. I held my breath, gripping the knife again. My wife stirred beside me but didn't wake. I listened, every muscle tense. Then the tent moved. A light press against the fabric, just enough to shift it. Someone was out there. Someone was standing right next to us. I stayed frozen, waiting, heart pounding so loud I swore they could hear it. Then, after what felt like forever, the pressure on the tent disappeared. Footsteps moved away, slow and deliberate, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I waited until the first light, then unzipped the tent carefully, stepping out with the knife ready. There were no footprints, nothing disturbed, but I knew what I had heard. I told my wife then. She was uneasy but tried to reason it away. Maybe an animal had brushed against the tent. Maybe the wind. I knew better. We debated packing up, but we had planned for a few more days, and neither of us wanted to leave just because of a feeling. Still, I was on edge the whole day, checking the trees, listening. That night, we made the fire bigger, letting it burn longer before putting it out. I lay in the tent, eyes open, waiting. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. They stopped just outside the tent. Then came the sound of slow, heavy breathing. Not an animal, not the wind, person. I felt my wife tense beside me. She was awake this time. She heard it too. The breathing stayed there for minutes, just outside. Then the slow sound of movement circling the tent. I gripped the knife so tight my hand ached. Then suddenly it stopped. The woods fell silent. We waited, listening. Nothing. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light broke, I stepped out, scanning the area. This time there were footprints, large ones, circling our tent. We packed up fast, stuffing everything into the truck, barely speaking. As we drove back down that narrow dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing just beyond the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure, not moving, just watching us leave. We never went back. I had been camping all my life. It wasn't something I did as a weekend hobby or just because I wanted to get away from the world. It was part of me. It was the way I grew up. My dad had taken me out into the woods since I was a kid, teaching me how to build a fire, how to track animals, how to read the land. So, by the time I was in my late 30s, heading out on my own for a weekend trip wasn't anything special. It was just another camping trip, something I'd done dozens of times before. This time, I had chosen a remote area in northern Montana. I liked places that didn't have official campsites or pre-made fire pits. I wanted to be in the wild, really out there. The more isolated, the better. I had found a spot on an old topographic map, deep in the national forest, about 20 miles from the nearest town. No trails, no signs of civilization, just trees, rivers, and mountains. That's what I wanted. I parked my truck on the side of an old Forest Service road, loaded up my pack, and started hiking. The air was crisp, the kind of autumn cold that made your breath fog even though the sun was shining. The trees were a mix of evergreens and the last of the fading yellow aspens, their leaves crunching under my boots. I had about a 5-mile hike to the spot I had marked on my map, a clearing near a small river where I planned to set up camp for a couple of nights. As I walked, I kept an eye out for tracks. You could tell a lot about a place by the tracks you found: deer, elk, maybe a black bear if you were lucky. But I didn't see much. The ground was mostly undisturbed, like not many animals had come through recently. That was a little unusual for an area this deep in the woods. But I didn't think much of it at the time. I reached my campsite by late afternoon. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of dry wood for a fire, and the river just a few yards away. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and cooked a simple meal. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. That was the best part about being out there. The quiet. No cars, no voices, no distractions. Just the sound of the fire crackling and the river running. As the sun set, the temperature dropped fast. I threw a few more logs on the fire and sat back, watching the flames. That's when I noticed something. The woods around me were completely silent. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. That was odd. Usually, even at night, you'd hear something: owls, small animals moving around, the wind in the trees. But it was dead silent. I tried to shake the feeling off, but something about it put me on edge. I grabbed my flashlight and did a quick walk around my camp, checking for tracks. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not animal tracks. Human footprints. They were just outside the light of my fire, in the soft dirt near the trees. And they weren't mine. I could tell because they were smaller, and the tread on the boots wasn't the same as mine. Someone else had been here. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I wasn't scared, not yet, but I didn't like it. I had picked this spot because it was supposed to be remote, far from any other campers or hikers. And yet, someone had been here recently. I followed the tracks a little way into the trees, but they disappeared into the underbrush. Whoever it was had been careful. They hadn't left much of a trail. I went back to my fire and sat down, trying to figure out what to do. I could leave, pack up and hike back to my truck in the dark. But I didn't want to do that. I was armed, I had a rifle and a sidearm just in case of bears. I wasn't defenseless, so I stayed. I barely slept that night. Every little sound had me on edge. Every crack of a branch had me reaching for my flashlight. But nothing happened. By morning, I almost convinced myself I had overreacted. Maybe the tracks were old. Maybe they had been from a hunter passing through days ago. But I wasn't convinced. I spent the next day fishing in the river, trying to push the thought out of my mind. I cooked my catch over the fire, enjoying the peace of the woods, trying to remind myself why I loved being out here. But as the sun started to set again, that uneasy feeling returned. I decided to do another sweep around my campsite just to be sure. That's when I found something that made my stomach drop. More footprints, fresh ones, and they were closer this time. Whoever it was had been watching me. That was it. I wasn't going to wait around to see who it was or what they wanted. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, throwing everything into my backpack. I doused my fire, grabbed my rifle, and started hiking back toward my truck. The whole way, I felt like I was being watched. Every few steps, I'd stop and listen, my heart pounding. But I never saw anyone, never heard anyone, just that same unnatural silence in the woods. When I finally made it back to my truck, I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath. Then, just before I turned the key, I saw something in the trees, a figure, standing just at the edge of the woods, half hidden in the shadows. Watching me, I didn't wait. I started the truck, threw it into gear, and got the hell out of there. I never went back to that spot. I still camp, still go out into the woods, but I stick to places where I know people will be nearby. I don't go so deep anymore, because whoever was out there that night, they weren't lost. They weren't just passing through. They were watching me, and I don't ever want to know why. I always liked camping alone. It wasn't because I didn't have friends or family who wanted to come along, but there was something about being out there with nothing but the trees, the sounds of the night, and my own thoughts that made me feel at peace. It was different from everyday life, where there were always people, always noise, always distractions. Out in the woods, it was just me and the world, and I liked it that way. That changed after my last trip. It was early autumn, the kind of time when the days were warm, but the nights were cold enough to remind you winter was coming. I had taken a few days off work and decided to drive upstate to a camping area I had been to once before, but never alone. It wasn't an official campsite with designated spots or any real amenities, just a large stretch of forest land where people sometimes camped. I parked my truck at the end of an old dirt road, hiked about a mile in, and found a good spot. It was in a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees on three sides, with a slight slope leading down to a narrow creek about 50 yards away. The ground was mostly dry, with just enough softness to make sleeping on it bearable. I spent the first day setting everything up. My tent was an older one, but it still held up well. I gathered firewood, got my small cooking setup ready, and made sure everything was where I needed it. By late afternoon, I was sitting by the fire, drinking a beer, and feeling good about the decision to come out here. The first night was normal. I heard the usual sounds, rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds settling in, and the occasional snap of a branch from some unseen animal moving in the dark. I fell asleep easily, only waking up a few times when the cold crept into my sleeping bag. It was the next day when things started feeling off. I woke up early, made some coffee, and took a short walk around. The air was crisp, and the morning mist still clung to the trees. Everything seemed normal until I noticed something strange about 50 feet from my campsite. There were footprints, not animal tracks, boot prints. At first, I thought they were mine. I had walked around the area a bit the previous day, but as I looked closer, I realized they weren't. The pattern on the soles was different from my boots, and more importantly, they hadn't been there before. Someone had been near my campsite during the night. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe another camper had passed through. Maybe it was an old print I hadn't noticed. Still, it bothered me. I looked around a bit more but didn't see anything else unusual, so I tried to brush it off. The day went by uneventfully. I fished at the creek for a while, cooked some food, and read a book. I told myself I was overthinking things. By the time night fell, I had convinced myself it was nothing. That night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. There was no loud noise, no sudden movement, just a feeling, something that pulled me out of sleep. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only a faint orange glow. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it, a soft sound, just beyond the tree line. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, not the careless movement of an animal, but something else, someone else. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. The footsteps moved, circling my campsite at a distance. My heart pounded. I reached for the knife I always kept by my sleeping bag, gripping it tight. The steps continued for what felt like an eternity, then stopped. Silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening, waiting, but nothing else happened. When the sun finally came up, I got out of my tent and looked around. No footprints this time, no signs that anyone had been there, but I knew what I had heard. I should have left right then, but I didn't. Instead, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired, that it had been some animal after all. I didn't want to ruin the trip over something I couldn't even prove was real, so I stayed. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned shades of orange and purple, I felt it again. That same feeling from the night before, like I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, but my nerves were on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then I saw him, a figure standing just at the edge of the woods, half hidden by the trees. Too far to see clearly, but close enough to know he was looking at me. He didn't move. He just stood there. A chill ran through me. I forced myself to keep my breathing steady. I didn't want to let him know I had seen him. I moved casually, pretending I hadn't noticed, slowly reaching for my knife. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. I didn't see him leave. 1 second he was there, the next he wasn't. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire burning high, gripping my knife, waiting. I thought about packing up, but I didn't want to risk moving through the woods in the dark. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the fire was nearly out, and the first light of dawn was creeping through the trees. I sat up, stretching, trying to shake the stiffness from my body, and then I saw it, lying in the dirt, just a few feet from my tent. A single boot print, fresh. Whoever he was, he had been closer than I thought. I packed up and left. Fast. I didn't even bother cooking breakfast or breaking down my camp properly. I just shoved everything into my pack, doused the fire, and started moving. The hike back to my truck felt twice as long as before. Every rustling leaf, every shifting shadow made my pulse spike. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him again. But I didn't. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I forced myself to take one last look in the rearview mirror, and there he was, standing at the tree line, just barely visible through the morning mist, watching me leave. I never went back. It was late September, the kind of cold that settled into your bones the moment you stopped moving. The rain had started in the afternoon, a light drizzle that slowly built into a steady downpour by nightfall. I had been walking for most of the day, my backpack heavy with gear, my boots caked in mud from the narrow trails that cut through the damp woods. I was somewhere in the Peak District, though I hadn't kept close track of my exact location. The plan had been simple: hike out for a few days, set up camp, and clear my head. By the time I found a decent spot to set up my tent, the rain had become relentless. My jacket was soaked through, my gloves clinging to my fingers with a damp chill. The trees around me were tall and twisted, their branches stretching overhead like skeletal fingers. It was the kind of place that felt untouched, where the silence was thick and the air carried the weight of something ancient. I pitched my tent as fast as I could, my hands fumbling with the poles and fabric. The rain made everything harder. Every movement felt sluggish. Every attempt to secure the stakes met with resistance from the slick, uneven ground. When I finally crawled inside, the fabric sagged slightly from the weight of the rain, the steady drum of droplets against the nylon filling the space. I stripped off my wet clothes, shoving them into a corner of the tent, and pulled on dry thermals. The air inside was damp, but at least it was warmer than outside. I had brought enough supplies to last me a few days. Simple food, enough water to get by, and my stove for boiling more when needed. I cooked a quick meal, the smell of hot soup filling the tent, though it did little to chase away the unease settling in my stomach. I wasn't afraid of camping alone. I had done it plenty of times before in worse conditions, but something about this night felt different. The rain masked all other sounds, making it impossible to tell if something, or someone, was moving outside. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, the way the darkness felt heavier when the world was wrapped in rain. Still, I kept my knife within reach. Hours passed. The rain never let up. If anything, it got worse. The wind picked up, making the trees groan under its weight. My tent shuddered with each gust, and I found myself gripping the fabric above me out of instinct, as if I could hold it together through sheer will. I tried to sleep, but it didn't come easy. Every noise made my pulse quicken. Every creak of the trees set my nerves on edge. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke to the sensation of something pressing against the side of the tent. It wasn't the wind. The weight was too steady, too deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I lay completely still, listening. The rain continued its relentless drumming, but beneath it, I could hear something else. Faint shuffling, the sound of footsteps shifting in the mud just outside my tent. I stayed frozen, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My brain scrambled for explanations, an animal, maybe a deer wandering too close. But the steps were too slow, too careful. They stopped directly outside the tent. I reached for my knife, my fingers wrapping around the handle. My mouth had gone dry, my breathing shallow. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound. I strained my ears, listening for anything over the rain, but whoever or whatever was out there wasn't moving anymore. Minutes passed. My muscles ached from staying still, but I didn't dare shift. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that the paranoia of being alone in the middle of nowhere was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate scraping sound, like something being dragged across the fabric of my tent. I gripped my knife tighter. My brain screamed at me to do something. Shout, lash out, anything, but fear held me down. The scraping stopped, replaced by silence so deep it felt suffocating. I counted the seconds in my head. forcing myself to focus on something, anything, to keep from panicking. Then, without warning, the entire tent shook violently. The poles strained under the force, the rain fly whipping against the fabric. I scrambled up, knife in hand, ready to fight if I had to. I unzipped the tent in one quick motion, shoving my way out into the rain. The cold hit me first. The air was biting, the rain drenching me instantly. My flashlight was in my other hand, and I flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. The ground around my tent was slick with mud, my footprints mixed in with something else. Indistinct shapes, too messy to make out clearly in the rain. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the woods, my breath coming in short bursts. Still nothing. I stood there for what felt like forever, the rain dripping from my face, my heart still hammering in my chest. I knew I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been out here, watching, waiting. I packed up as fast as I could. My hands were shaking, my gear a mess as I shoved it back into my pack. I didn't care about the rain anymore. I just needed to move. I hiked through the night, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. Every few steps, I turned back, half expecting to see a figure standing in the distance, watching me. But the woods remained empty, just rain, trees, and the weight of something I couldn't quite explain pressing down on me. I reached my car just as the first light of dawn started creeping through the clouds. My clothes were soaked, my muscles aching. I threw my pack into the back seat and got inside, locking the doors behind me. My hands were still shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. I didn't look back.